Okay, the next concept I want to talk about is port security and 802.1x, basically securing physical access to the network. So, what do I mean by that? Well, we want to control the ability of someone to just walk into our environment, whether it be a kiosk at a retail store or a library or a school or what have you, or even within our corporate environment. We don't want to necessarily have someone being able to walk up, pull out their laptop, pull out a Cat5 cable, plug it into the wall, and gain access to our network. All right, so one way we can do that is through something called port security. Now, this is particularly applicable to things like kiosks, schools, libraries, things along those lines. Not necessarily throughout an entire environment. It becomes a little bit unwieldy at that point. But for specialized situations where we want to control specific access to specific ports, port security is definitely a good fit there. So what we can do is configure a switch so that it only learns one MAC address per port. All right, so we can keep attackers from sending multiple fake addresses. So in other words, someone can't pull out their laptop, plug in, and then just start bombarding our network with fake MAC addresses. Because if you recall, when we have our devices and it connects to a switch, the very first time it does that, it goes out and tries to get an IP address via DHCP, or it may have one hard-coded. It's going to try to ARP for some resources. It might go to DNS. It might go to whatever the case might be, try to resolve a URL. Whatever action is taking place, it's going to put datagrams onto the network. As soon as it does that, the MAC address of that device is attached to that datagram. Okay, it's a layer 2 piece of information. The switch, which is a layer 2 device, will learn or memorize that MAC address and associate it with that port. And so the switch will learn over time all of the devices that are connected to it, what MAC addresses are associated with which ports, so that way when information comes in, it knows what port to send that information out of. Okay, so it's a very directed process. Broadcast obviously will go out all ports, but if it's traffic between PC1 and PC2, PC1 is connected to port 1, PC2 is connected to port 10 as an example, it will only go in port 1 and out port 10. Okay, so that keeps things more secure. However, as I was mentioning, we have malicious individuals or malicious activity that can take place where someone could flood a specific port and basically overrun the MAC table on that switch and bring it down. So by setting port security and only allowing certain MAC addresses or one MAC address per port, we negate that ability for someone to do that type of activity. All right, so we can also use that in conjunction with something called 802.1x to strengthen security at the wall jack. Okay, as I mentioned before with a school setting as an example, or a kiosk, we have something called 802.1x authentication, and what that really is EPAL, or Extensible Authentication Access Protocol over LAN, okay, over local area network. So that Extensible Authentication Access Protocol gives us the ability to say, hey, when somebody connects to our server, or I'm sorry, to our wall jack, we're not going to allow them to communicate until they actually authenticate with the network. All right, so they're going to authenticate with something called a radius server. Okay, it's an authentication server. So in this scheme, as you see here, it's a multi-part process. The client, which is in the terms of this authentication process, is called a supplicant. The client is going to initiate a request that they're going to plug into the wall jack. They're going to say, hey, can I communicate? The switch is going to say, no, not until you authenticate. So it will only allow EPOL traffic to pass through that port. It will send it off to the authentication server. And again, all of these things have to be configured in place so that this process takes place. But once it's set up, the port will not be activated until that authentication process is complete. So the supplicant will send information to the switch. The switch will then forward it onto the authentication server. Once the credentials are validated and verified, okay, in other words, the client is authenticated, then the authentication server sends that information back and says, yes, you can communicate. The port is now wide open. And of course, the supplicant or the client can communicate on the network.